Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Great Lakes Green Chemistry Network and Michigan Green Chemistry Clearinghouse monthly webinar series. We're very happy to have you today. And we're going to have a terrific presentation. We're really excited to have Dennis McGavis from Goodyear Rubber and Tire here today to present a really, great talk about the auto industry, which is an area that we really like to begin providing as much more information about as we can. As I said earlier, we're so happy today to have Dennis McGavis with us as our presenter. He is the Director of EHS Sustainability at Goodyear Rubber and Tire, and he has quite an impressive resume. He has served in this position since April of last year, but he is also Goodyear's co-chair. Oh, sorry, folks, just lost. Sorry about that. He's also the Goodyear's co-chair of the CEO Environmental Initiative for the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. He has over 30 years of experience in product stewardship, sustainability, and energy initiatives. He's worked for companies such as Shaw Industries. He spent 20 years at HP and has been at Seagate. He co-developed the first Energy Stars program for office equipment and invented the product stewardship domain. Dennis has an MS in Environmental Engineering and Management from Colorado State University and a BAS from Electrical Engineering from Boise State University. So I'm very happy to be able to turn it over now to Dennis, and welcome to the webinar, Dennis.
Thank you, Lynn. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Excellent. So what we're going to do is just start with a little bit of background around what the Suppliers Partnership is. So basically it's a partnership between the automakers, their supply chain, and the U.S. EPA, and their objective is to develop projects and programs that enhance not only environmental sustainability but also provide economic value to the automotive supply chain. And you can see here some of the members of this group, some of the companies, as well as some of the partners and other liaisons to this organization. Okay. And there's some specific focus areas for the Suppliers Partnership. And the one we're going to talk about today is the Chemical Issues Management Work Group. There's also a group that focuses on energy and water, materials efficiency. There's a North American focus group that focuses on North American issues, renewable energy, technology, and networking. Regarding chemical issues, this work group was formed in 2006. Basically, they wanted to start following emerging chemical regs, develop some strategic approaches to that, and share best practices across the automotive supply chain. And then the Materials Assessment Strategy, or MAS group or program, started in 2007. And what they wanted to do with that group is to develop a common health and environmental hazard, exposure and risk screening process for chemicals and ingredients that show up in vehicle parts and processes. And then they contracted with an organization called Science Strategies to develop that process. And that work group is chaired by Dave Woodyard, who is my global manager for sustainability here at Goodyear. Okay. And some of the drivers behind, or what sort of triggered this group to start their work, were some of these regulations you see here, and you probably are very familiar with some of these, with the advent of not only EU REACH, but also the global versions of REACH or flavors of REACH that are starting to proliferate around the world. And then, of course, the state of California's Safer Consumer Products draft regulation or proposed regulation. And then some other U.S. regulations that are starting to pop up, and then, of course, the reinitiation of the Toxic Substance Control Act, or the reinstitution or change of that. Okay. And some of the basic drivers or market drivers that tend to show up are things like regulations, like we just talked about, competitive activity, customers and investors, and this idea of globalization. So in other words, these distributed supply chains that are starting to get a little bit more broad as well as deep. So it's becoming more and more urgent and also tricky in order to get at those various suppliers in that global web. And then in terms of the public and NGOs, the NGOs tend to play the role of being advocates that are driving public concern, or at least being the stewards for public concern. So some of the challenges for the automotive sector were basically companies that are manufacturers of articles, and typically they're not wired to think about chemicals. And so what they have to do now is start to think more like chemical companies think in terms of the ingredients that go into their products. And so there's very limited or low or no toxicological expertise in many of these companies in the automotive supply chain. So they're typically used to considering chemicals in formulations, but not necessarily in articles or parts that go into automotive or truck type products. Okay. So the importance of this group, this MAS group, was to not only address these emerging regulations, but also to help businesses reduce risk across the enterprise as well as cost, and also add value. So in other words, open up the idea of perhaps differentiating the automotive sector in some ways, and then also developing a process to address any of these emerging issues around chemicals within the supply chain. Okay. And some of the operating principles were to have the group engaged and have the participants challenge one another, and so that we're basically developing a level playing field where everybody can agree on what that playing field looks like. There is still competition, as everyone has to understand, but at the same time agreeing on where that level playing field sits. And then practice, not only continual improvement, but also pursue leadership opportunities for the sector, and then be flexible and open to change, because the automotive sector is a fairly long in the two sectors. It's been around for a long time. It's been around since the late 1800s, and it's typically, not open to being as flexible as some of these, emerging requirements that have been happening in the market. For example, the changing roles of NGOs and the changing roles of customers. Okay. And then some of the principles, again, in terms of assessment or approaching assessing ingredients in articles was, to embrace this whole spirit of continual improvement, consider both hazard and risk, and then do that in the context of the entire life cycle of the product. And then we started using chemical lists, or the lists of lists that exist around the world, as a starting point. And then the approach here is, with phase one, the principles and framework were developed. The phase two is to develop a common risk assessment set of parameters and identify the appropriate tools to assess human exposure in vehicle interiors. Okay, then phase three was to build upon that and then address vehicle wear debris, such as the wear from brakes and tires or other exterior materials that they emit from vehicles. And then phase four was to then address the vehicle end-of-life issues or activities. Okay. And what it is not, it's not at this point a comprehensive hazard assessment, dose response, exposure assessment, and risk characterization that describes both the science and the art associated with these elements of risk assessment. And it's also not intended to guide refined, complex assessments of potential exposures. Okay? But what it is it's a starting point for companies who have not been previously engaged in this approach because they're not used to doing risk assessments or hazard assessments or assessing chemicals in this way, but it gives them a way to look at it through a lens of hazard and risk that they didn't have before. Okay? And it's a way for them to screen, again, to develop a prioritized list of what those highest concerns are from their stakeholders. And it also provides a way to prioritize those risks. Okay? And then it will also enable better design of products going forward, and then also minimize issues associated with end-of-life vehicle processing. That's what the ELV stands for. Okay? And then in terms of the guidelines, the use of the outputs are going to be fed back into the design stage of products, and also provide, best practice sharing across the supply chain and across the life cycle of product around, ingredients and material optimization. And some of the considerations there is, are there acceptable alternatives available? Because sometimes they're not, right? But you look at it from the standpoint of not only cost and function, but also supply. And some of the functional aspects of that have to be evaluated over some longer periods of time, because sometimes, for example, vehicles have to be road tested for months and sometimes 1 to 2 years before alternatives can be selected, because the issue of safety is a much bigger issue in the automotive sector than maybe some other sectors. Okay? And some of the options can also include the reduction of, the concentration of specific chemicals of concern in any of these products that go into a vehicle. And you can modify or reduce the availability of a chemical or the chemical's business life cycle or the availability of that chemical. And you can substitute where you can. And sometimes, you decide there's no action that can be taken because the ingredients you're using are the only ones available at that time. So the Phase 4 deliverables will be a set of assessment parameters around the end-of-life vehicle materials, including, exposure assessment scenarios and guidelines for determining, what the exposure scenarios are going to be based on use and conditions of the chemical or the article in the vehicle. And then there's going to be a pilot exposure algorithm for these materials. And then the corresponding algorithm will also be developed for human health and environmental risk as well. Okay? And the output there will be based on hazard, exposure, and risk characteristics to enable a cross-article comparative assessment. So you can look at Article A or Article B in a typical vehicle. Okay. And the current status on that, or here's the current status of the various phases, I should say. So we've completed Phase 2, which was the interior of the vehicle. So there we have a hazard and dose assessment guideline. We have an exposure assessment guideline, a risk assessment guideline, and business process management guideline for the interiors for vehicles. And then for Phase 3, the wear debris, so things like tire and road wear particles or brake particles, we have hazard and dose response guideline, exposure assessment, as well as risk assessment guidelines. Phase 4 is in development, and the next steps around that is to develop this detailed hazard evaluation framework for end-of-life vehicles. That will include a specification of various exposure scenarios, and then it will be a voluntary implementation of that. So you could see company-specific approaches or flavors of how that gets implemented. Okay, and as you can see here, these are the contacts for the Suppliers Partnership. Steve Hellam, who may be on the phone, not sure. So if there's any questions about the Supplier Partnership, we can maybe direct them to Kellen. And Steve Hellam is the Executive Director of the Suppliers Partnership. So with that, if there are any questions, we can, I guess, take them now.
Thank you very much. Dennis, we do have some questions, and the first one that I'll start out with is, will you have environmental NGOs and other external review of your framework?
That's a good question, and that's something if Kellen, is Kellen on the phone by chance?
No, he's not.
Anyway, I would say that we would like to have that, have the external groups review it, because we know that there are other groups, such as you mentioned earlier, Lynn, in your opening announcements, the Clean Production Action, the Biz NGO group, with the green screen protocol, and there's also the US EPA DFE protocol, and of course members of that organization with the EPA are also members of this group. So we're trying to make sure that these various groups who have representatives from various NGO organizations, academic organizations, government organizations are included. So I think there is a desire to do that. I just can't comment right now on what the process will look like for that, or when when that engagement will start, or how deeply we've gotten into that at this point.
Thank you. Great. So we have another question, which is, how is Goodyear implementing the MAS?
Yeah, so the way Goodyear is doing this, we're looking at not only using the MAS to do hazard screening as well as risk assessment, we're also, in parallel with this MAS system, we're also going to be using the green screen for select chemicals. So in other words, when we have to look at, we have what's called a long-range chemical vintage chart, if you will, that says, look, here are all the ingredients or categories of ingredients that go into our products, and which are the ones that we're going to have to be looking for substitutes for. And then we'll take a short list, because it is very costly to put some of these chemicals through a full-blown assessment, either through the MAS system or through the green screen. And so we're going to use both of those to screen our chemicals, but we'll do it judiciously, again, because of cost, but we'll do that in a prioritized manner, because we should have a good sense of which chemicals either are targeted for future elimination because of that screening, or which ones present certain either human health or environmental impact or potential impacts based on either their manufacturing or their use in the product.
This next question, I think, is sort of asking an extension of what you were just talking about. It says, can you talk about any green chemistry activity within the Suppliers Partnership? And I think some of the discussion that we've been having is, relates to that in terms of the green screen and others, but maybe you can elaborate more specifically on that.
Yeah, I think that's to come. I'm getting the sense that this framework is just now getting developed and to a point where this group is ready to do that, to do what you're describing, because what the industry will want to do is to take a look at, for example, are there any, I'll call them commodity chemicals or commodity ingredients that go into automotive parts. And in other words, to separate out what might be considered either confidential business information or competitive information from, hey, these are things that everybody in the industry uses, and the industry or nobody in the industry decides it wants to differentiate itself within the use of any of these. And so there might be then from that point forward an agreement or alignment around, okay, which of those ingredients should this group take a look at and look for either alternatives or at least look to push it through this MAS framework.
I'm trying to order these questions in some sort of
logical manner.
Logical way, but let me just go ahead so that we don't have any awkward pauses here. So this is a more specific question. It says, how are the interior exposure tests being conducted?
Oh, good question. I can't, let's see if I can get this back off. Okay. I think that's a question for the group, because I can't say that I've been close enough to how that interior testing has been done to be able to answer that question. But I'm sure we could get back with an answer.
Okay.
But maybe you could log that for us, Lenny. We can.
Yes, definitely. Okay. Definitely. So now we have a question. I think it comes from David Vidosky, but I'm not sure. It says, we in EPA's Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention are developing exposure scenarios for vehicle interiors for some of the chemicals announced today as a focus for 2013. I don't know if people saw that announcement, but EPA has released a list of chemicals that it will be doing risk assessments on. How can we share information on exposure scenarios and learn more about the methodologies used in phases 1 and 2? My division is the home of DFE with our models of alternatives assessment, but also includes the exposure assessment branch. And just let me say that we will post on our website the announcement from EPA today about the chemicals that they'll be looking at.
Excellent. Well, yeah, I'd say the answer to that question is there are members from the EPA. Now, I don't know if they're members of the Pollution Prevention Division, but they're members of the EPA as members of this group. So I'm sure it would be very easy to be able to share that information and to share it, in both ways. So in other words, in addition to the EPA sharing what it would like to evaluate, but also the Suppliers Partnership and this MAS group in terms of what they're also interested in evaluating or having evaluated.
Great. And of course, if people are, you can reach Dennis directly through the email that was given at the end of his slides. So if you want to elaborate on some of these or establish some relationships, I'm sure he'd be happy to hear from you.
Absolutely.
The next question is Goodyear U.S. complying with or intending to follow the EU restriction on polyaromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, in auto tires?
Yes. The short answer is yes. And we're working with all our divisions worldwide, so not only in the U.S. and North America, but also our divisions in Europe and Asia and Latin America on that very issue. So the short answer is yes, and if you need more information than that, please let me know.
So I'm curious, though, as a follow-up to that, then in complying with those regulations in the EU, will that be also the case that those will be eliminated in the U.S.?
Yes, because the way we look at things at Goodyear is we look at, where are the most stringent requirements coming, out of, whether it's Europe or Asia, wherever it might be. And it really doesn't make sense as a manufacturer to get too regionalized or too localized, even though you do localize your products. But in terms of using specific materials and gaining an economy of scale with the cost of those materials, it really doesn't make sense to vary that from region to region. So we do look at it from the standpoint of where is the most stringent requirement on the planet, and then we design our products to that most stringent requirement.
Great, thank you. So the next question is, when the risk assessments are done, is there an indication that companies will use the information in R&D or suppliers to take a green chemistry approach, or is the focus on available alternatives on the market?
I think that is the intent. Yeah, I think the intent is for the members, the companies that are members of the Supplier Partnership to take that information back and integrate it into their design process and also share it with their suppliers, right? And then also if there are, like I said earlier, if there's a desire to do alternatives assessments as an industry, then maybe they would entertain that, but maybe as a minimum, each company might decide it wants to do its own alternative assessment. If it's something they consider, either confidential, or if it's something they think they might want to differentiate themselves on, but those, either way, that is the intent for either individual companies to do it, or for this group to do it if they decide there's going to be some chemicals that everybody shares and that there's no CBI or intellectual property wrapped up in those chemicals.
Has the auto sector developed a list of research priorities, areas that you would like to see green chemistry innovation, I guess areas where you would like to see green chemistry innovation because there are not adequate alternatives to a chemical that you'd like to phase out? Kind of a
yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Lynn. I interrupted you.
No, go ahead. I was just saying it's sort of a follow-up to the, I mean, it wasn't written that way, but it sort of follows on the last question, I think.
Yep. Yeah, I think there's probably a fairly healthy list there, but at least from a Goodyear perspective, we do struggle a bit, especially with things like rubber compounds. I think the plastics industry is a little bit further ahead than, say, the rubber industry, I would say, because rubber is a little bit more challenging in that you have to get various rubber compounds to stick to each other. For example, a tire has somewhere between 12 and 15 different rubber compounds in it. It has steel in it, it has fabric in it. So you try to get everything to stick together and hold together, with this, safety in mind when it's in use. And I think the plastics industry is a little bit further ahead in that respect. So that's one area, and I'm sure there are others as well, especially with respect to heat. Now, in other words, if there's areas of high heat, as an example, even when you have a plastic that has, flame retardants in it, if it's near a heat source, it's actually required by law to have flame retardants in it. So the challenge there is to find either flame retardant additives or to find plastic, formulations or polymers that can actually have those same behavioral characteristics as the flame retardants give them, if that makes any sense. So those are
that's actually, that could open up a whole new can of worms in terms of so much discussion going on right now in terms of fire retardants.
Yep.
Maybe we can come back to that because I want to make sure we get through all the questions that the listeners have posed for you. The next one is, what role is Goodyear playing in end-of-life recovery and reuse or repurposing of auto tires rather than piling up in landfills?
Yeah, that's a great question. So through the world, as Lynn mentioned earlier, I'm one of 3 co-chairs through the World Business Council for Sustainable Development on what's called the TIP program, or the Tire Industry Program. And one of the main work streams there is end-of-life tires. And we have programs around the world, and we're evaluating, where programs do not exist or where the programs are weak. The take-back and recycling programs for tires are weak. So a couple of examples there are China and Russia. And so right now we're focusing on those countries to make sure that those programs are in place, that they're strong, and that they're working. For example, in North America, I think the take-back and recycling rate is in the high 90%, like 97% or something to that effect. Now, it's not to say you don't find a few tires here and there that somebody has either illegally dumped or thrown on the side of the road because they shouldn't have, but we have high take-back and recycling rates in all developing countries around the world. And we're looking at now more of the developing economies and how strong those programs are. But it's being done through the World Business Council for Sustainable Development's TIP program.
Great. The next question, and you might have, this might have been reflected in one of your earlier slides, but the question is, are there chemical manufacturers engaged in the partnership?
I'd say indirectly, and I think there's, becoming more and more interest for them to engage directly. And when I say indirectly is, for example, Goodyear and other automotive suppliers, partner with companies like DuPont and BASF and Dow Chemical, et cetera, on a lot of these issues. And so they're always there, in the background, working behind the scenes with us. And they're always, partnering with us. If it isn't through, work through the Suppliers Partnership, it's also through other councils, for example, through the Conference Board. I think the Conference Board has a Product Stewardship Council, and the chemical companies show up there in fairly large numbers as well. And we discuss these issues, and we discuss these other groups, including the Suppliers Partnership. So they're always there, if I could say it that way.
Thank you.
They're always partnering with us, and not only partnering with us on the sustainability front, but also partnering with us on the innovation front. As an example, we partner with DuPont for using bioisoprene in our tires. Is just one example.
Yeah, I think that's a very important example, though. I think that's exactly at the heart of the question in terms of what kind of dialogue there is between the chemical companies and the other and the downstream users.
Yep.
So the next question is, does the MAS support the California Safer Consumer Products Alternatives Assessment process?
Well, I think I'm not sure I could speak wholeheartedly for the Suppliers Partnership. I think in principle it does, but it's also making sure that the appropriate inputs are made. Because I know that the California Safer Products Act is gathering a lot of input from a lot of groups right now as we speak. So there's some inputs being given around, well, what is the alternative assessment process going to look like? What makes up a sufficient alternative assessment? And also, how do you protect intellectual property and confidential business information? So those are examples of areas of dialogue that are going on right now, and the Suppliers Partnership is certainly providing its input into that.
Great. So here we have a comment and a question. Thank you for your great presentation. What are the hot spots, in your view, which should be improved in the sense of green chemistry with high priority? Tire wear, PVC and dashboards, chromium. Do you publish, for example, life cycle assessments to identify the issues with greatest impact? Thank you again.
Okay, great. Yeah, so there are some hot spots, and yes, so the short answer to the second part of the question, do we publish LCAs? Yes, we do. But another thing we're doing in that area to identify the hot spots is what we haven't yet done in all areas of the automotive supply chain is we haven't developed what are called product category rules for various product categories in the automotive supply chain. And what product category rules, or PCRs, help you do is they help frame how you do things like life cycle assessments. Okay, it helps define, for example, what is your functional unit? How do you measure the benefits of these life cycle impacts, or understanding life cycle impacts for tires or brakes or whatever product category you're considering? And so what we're trying to do is refine how that gets done and to do that better so we can have a way, a tool, and a process to identify hotspots. But from a high priority perspective, we have identified a few. So, for example, on the in the tire industry, we have identified tire and road wear particles as an example as a potential hotspot that we've been studying. That study's been going on for a number of years and will continue for the next couple of years. And then in other areas as well, we mentioned things like flame retardants in plastics, and there's also a few other hotspots like that have been identified as well through this Suppliers Partnership group. So yes, there is a way to do it right now, but also we're going to try to enhance how we get better visibility to those hotspots going forward.
So you mentioned in a response to this that you do publish the life cycle assessment. Where are those accessible if people want to look at them?
Yeah, you should be able to just Google them. Just Google, LCA for tires or whatever you're interested in. You should be able to find them.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Let's see. What alternative assessment methods would be used?
Oh, yeah, good question. So besides the MAS framework that's being developed here through the Suppliers Partnership, there are other methods that can be used as well, such as the green screen, the U.S. EPA's DFE program, and then there's also the cradle-to-cradle framework as well. Although the cradle-to-cradle framework is somewhat of a black box, it's not as open sourced as some of these other protocols are. So those are a few that are out there today.
Okay, so the next question is, are you doing the green screens, which you mentioned earlier that you were using that tool, internally or using Clean Production Action or someone else to help you with this tool?
We're doing it internally, but we are working with some consultants to help us with it, because it's not something you want to do at home without don't do this at home. No, it's something you want to do with a little bit of help, because if you don't have all the right toxicological expertise on your staff, you want to be able to find help where you need it, because when you go to evaluate the various toxicological endpoints, you may need different expertise. So we do make sure we have that expertise. If we don't have it in-house, we look for it outside.
I think you've already answered this basically, but maybe this is a little more specific to chemicals of concern. It says, do you have partners, NGOs, other, for your efforts working with chemicals of concern? I'm not sure if she means in identifying chemicals of concern or working, working on specific.
Yeah, I would think for identifying, yes, we do certainly partner with different NGO groups, and we do it through these forums like Lynn mentioned earlier, like the Biz NGO forum. We also engage with the GST3 forum, the Green Chemistry and Commerce Council, and other forums like that, where you have these multi-stakeholder groups that make up folks from the NGO community, folks from the academic community, the government community, and then industry, where everybody's coming together to solve these common problems. So we engage with those various groups, and we get that intelligence that way and that guidance that way. And then when it comes to developing alternatives, we look at where that investment has to go. For example, as I mentioned earlier, if it's a commodity chemical, maybe it's done through the supplier partnership. But if it's something that we find we might want to need to protect some of the intellectual property, the investment, because it's going to take a big investment to replace a certain chemical. Because sometimes it can take, for example, if you want to replace a specific chemical, it can cost you $1 to $2 million just to evaluate it, and then it could possibly cost you another $50 to $100 million to replace it and field test it, et cetera. So we have to be judicious about when we do that and how we do that. But I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. I just want to encourage people to ask questions. We have enough time for several more questions if you're interested, so please don't hesitate to get those questions up there. So the next question is, how does the work group weigh hazard reduction versus exposure control in the risk assessment process?
Good question. I think that's, again, a detail that the framework looks at, and it does look at, where are the hazards, where are the hazard hotspots, and then on the risk assessment side, then it looks at it from a life cycle perspective. So where are the risks in the life cycle? For example, is there a risk during the manufacturing process? And then is there a risk in the, when it makes its way into the product? Or is there a risk in the use phase of the product? Or is there a risk, when it's part of an end-of-life vehicle? So I think from a hazard perspective, you look at it, just on the input side, where are there any hazard traits? And then from the risk perspective, you look at it then once it enters into the life cycle. If that makes sense. I hope that makes sense.
I think so. What is the biggest chemical of concern facing scrutiny by Goodyear in its tire product?
Oh, there isn't any one big one right now, because I think somebody mentioned earlier the aromatic oil issue and the PAHs. That was one of the bigger ones, in recent history for the tire industry. But we are evaluating some other, smaller issues, but they're more around the types of chemicals used to help make rubber compounds stick to each other or to stick to steel or metal. It's usually those they sometimes call them tactifiers, or those compounds that help your rubber compounds stick and make the tire sort of stay together. Some may recall some years ago there was an incident with a particular tire that actually came apart on one of the, I think it was a Ford vehicle, and it caused some injuries. So that's something we're always very, very conscious of and very aware of, is making sure that the tire will hold up under use, but also at the same time making sure we look at those specific additives that are being used to keep these rubber compounds together. So I think that's our next sort of set of challenges, is those chemicals that help all the rubber compounds stick together.
Thank you. Well, I have a question that I want to sneak in also. That when I first contacted you, we talked about somewhat, this is a more general question, but maybe you could talk about the challenges, how the challenges that a company like Goodyear and the auto industry and other what we might call heavy industries face that are either unique to those industries or that, are different from further down the supply chain?
That's a great question. A couple of challenges that are unique. One is, as I mentioned earlier, this whole issue of safe use of the product. So safety is such a big thing, and so what that means is to effectively field trial something like a tire, for example, it could take anywhere from 1 to 2 years. So, for example, my experience in the electronic sector, at HP with something like a PC or a printer, it doesn't take years to field test something in a PC or a printer. But for something like a tire or an automobile, it could take, a year or two before you effectively test an alternative, in one of those products. So that's one unique challenge. Another unique challenge is the perception, I think, that the public has of the industry. They perceive the industry to be heavy industry, very, heavy use of chemicals, materials, et cetera. And that's something that, the industry, the automotive sector has been focused on for many years. And actually there's been a lot of great progress made. And not sure that the automotive sector has done a great job of communicating that to the market. So I think that's another unique aspect to the automotive sector in general, is that it's, not been used to communicating those kinds of things to the market. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And I have one more question, also that you and I discussed earlier that I think is very interesting. It may have a narrower application, but I was, interested in what you thought the role of NGOs are, of, groups who are working on chemicals policy and some of these other areas to bring companies together. What do you think are specific things that NGOs can do that are particularly useful to the processes that you're undergoing with the MAS and the Suppliers Partnership and so forth?
Yeah, I think the usefulness or the value there is, obviously partnering, but also, helping, how should I put it, for example, with groups like the BizNGO and some of these other groups that are helping to provide input to states or country governments or what have you around various requirements, or also communicating to the market around what's going on in the green chemistry space, is helping not become experts per se, because we can't all be experts in everything, but at least understand some of these challenges that we face, as that the industry faces, because I think we have to do this together. And I don't know that any one group can do this, can solve these problems. We have to solve them together, because they're difficult problems. Because another unique challenge that we haven't yet talked about is the post-consumer supply chain. We've had a couple hundred years now of understanding and building a pre-consumer supply chain. But now we're also, with things like take back and recycling, we're trying to build a post-consumer supply chain. Right? So on one hand, for example, governments are wanting cleaner chemicals or cleaner ingredients in their products, which is great, and we're all working toward that. And then on the other hand, they also want increased recycled content and post-consumer content in products. Well, that post-consumer content was designed 10, 15, 20 years ago. Right? And it's not as clean as today's ingredients. So I think we have to keep all that in mind and figure out ways to solve those problems.
Yeah, thank you. That's very interesting. Well, I don't see any more questions, but there's still a chance if you want to post something before we finish. I'd like to take the opportunity before we hang up to, again, thank Dennis for this really interesting presentation. We really appreciate your time, and I think that it's been very, elucidating about a lot of the issues that are and the work that's going on in your industry. So thank you so much, and I want to remind people that the slides from this presentation will be available at www.migreenchemistry.org later today, and that next week you'll be able to listen to the entire presentation with slides again by going to our website, glgc.org, or the Michigan Green Chemistry website that I just gave you. And please tell other people about it if they missed it, that they can still take advantage of it and listen to it. I also want to take this moment to point out that to let people know that there's an opportunity to comment on the IC2, which is the Interstate Chemicals Clearinghouse Guidance for Alternatives Assessment. You can get all the information about that on our website, but I think this is a really good opportunity. It's the Guidance for Alternatives Assessment and Risk Reduction is available for public comment, for public review and comment, and that will be available until the middle of April, until April 19th. So if you have an interest in this, I really encourage you to check that out. I also want to let you know that there are a number of webinars that are being presented this year by the Safer Chemicals Challenge program, and you can see the schedule of that at www.p2, that's P as in pollution, p2.org. The Safer Chemicals Challenge program is part of the grant that we're operating under from the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, and it's an opportunity for companies to join in and get recognition and be able to codify some of the their efforts at pollution prevention using green chemistry. And finally, I want to tell you all that the Great Lakes Green Chemistry Network, in collaboration with the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy in Minneapolis, will be sponsoring 4 workshops this year on tools for businesses. And our first one will be held in Ohio, in Columbus, Ohio, on May 30th, 2013, and it's called Safe Products Made Safely, Tools for Businesses. And you can find out more information about that at our website, but this will be sponsored by the Great Lakes Green Chemistry Network, the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, Ohio State University, Ohio EPA, and the University of Toledo, and also from the American Sustainable Business Council. So I encourage you to look into that. Subsequent future workshops will be held in the fall, and there will be one that will be held in Wisconsin in October, and also in New York State, and then next January, which is pretty far away, but there will be one in Minneapolis. So please do check out our website. The 8th Annual GC Innovators Roundtable is happening next in May in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and that was something that Dennis referred to, the Green Chemistry and Commerce Council. Their meetings are really interesting, and I highly encourage them. So I just wanted to let you know about those and what's on the website. And thank you all again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next month, or hearing you next month, April 9th at 3 p.m. Eastern with Mike Beliveau. Thanks very much, everyone.